The lobby of Whitmore Financial shimmered with 10,000 tiny lights, each reflecting off polished marble and the brass of the revolving doors, yet the glow did little to warm the chill that had settled over Daniel Mercer's chest. Christmas Eve had transformed the office into a display of cheer, garlands looping around banisters, a miniature tree blinking its soft green and red rhythm atop the reception desk. Holiday music trickled from hidden speakers, a gentle soundtrack to the invisible weight pressing on Daniel's shoulders. He walked through it like a man moving through snowdrifts, careful to avoid the spectacle, careful to avoid noticing how the other employees lingered in their cubicles, whispering in low voices, their eyes darting toward him. He had been summoned unexpectedly to a conference room on the 32nd floor. The elevator ride was long enough for him to hear the faint, synthetic tinkle of a Christmas carol filtering through the building's ventilation system. He gripped the strap of his leather briefcase with one hand, the other curling around a folder that seemed suddenly heavy with anticipation, though it held nothing of his choosing. Sophie's small hand had pressed against his as they entered the building, her warmth a small island against the cold winter air. She was waiting downstairs, waiting for him, her innocence intact, unaware of what might happen in the glass-walled room where power and consequence would collide. When he arrived, Clare Ashworth was already seated, a vision of poised authority against the stark white walls. Her posture was impeccable, the way she leaned slightly forward, hands folded on the polished conference table, radiating the calm precision of someone who had never let uncertainty linger for long. Her sharp cheekbones caught the reflected light, a subtle reminder that she had built Whitmore Financial from a modest regional firm into a national powerhouse. Emotion was a luxury she had long since abandoned. She regarded him with the same neutral gaze one might give a spreadsheet, calculating, efficient, unyielding. Daniel, for his part, did not flinch. He met her eyes once, just long enough to see nothing but resolution mirrored there, and then turned his attention to the documents she placed before him. The air in the conference room felt impossibly thin, the festive music fading into a background hum as if it, too, were holding its breath. Daniel read through the letter, each word more devastating than the last, yet his movements remained deliberate, his expression betraying nothing of the storm behind his eyes. There was no argument, no pleading, no raised voice. He signed his name on the dotted line with the precision of someone accustomed to responsibility, the pen scratch against paper echoing too loudly in the sterile silence. Clare observed without a flicker of hesitation, her professional satisfaction tempered by an unacknowledged weight pressing at the edges of her consciousness, an unfamiliar sense of guilt she pushed down immediately, as though it were an errant memo to be filed away. Outside, Sophie pressed her small face against the glass of the conference room door. Her fingers traced the outline of the polished metal frame, her eyes wide, drinking in the sight of her father, the man who held her universe, reduced to signing away his livelihood. Daniel noticed her, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a silent reassurance that he understood, that he bore the burden for both of them. He gathered the papers, his spine straight, each step toward the door a quiet assertion of dignity in the face of a world that had suddenly turned cruel. The lobby, once a place of holiday cheer, now seemed a mausoleum of what had been. The lights blinked, the garlands swayed gently with the building's ventilation, and Daniel Mercer walked out, leaving behind a space filled with quiet whispers, the muted clatter of keyboards, and the scent of pine and tinsel that had nothing to do with the grief he carried with him. Sophie tugged at the sleeve of his coat, her voice trembling in the sudden hush. He knelt down, inhaling the scent of her shampoo, memorizing her innocence, and whispered a truth he could barely keep in his own voice: sometimes doing the right thing comes without reward. She considered him seriously, forehead furrowed, as if trying to understand the invisible fracture in their lives, and he lifted her small hand into his. Together they left the lobby, the winter wind brushing against their cheeks, carrying with it a sharp reminder of what had been lost and what they would still have to endure. Daniel Mercer returned to his apartment that night not with the relief of a weekend beginning, but with the hollow weight of disbelief pressing into his chest. The city outside glittered with holiday lights, but inside, every shadow in the modest living room seemed to mock him. Sophie had curled up on the couch with her favorite blanket, a crayon drawing still clutched in her small hand, a depiction of their hands intertwined under a sun she had colored yellow, because it made me happy, Daddy. He stared at it, memorizing every uneven line, every purple letter spelling out, "Best Daddy," and felt the anger coil tighter in his chest. Not at Sophie, not at the world, but at someone invisible, someone who had crafted a lie so meticulous it had destroyed everything he had built. Richard Thorne. The name burned in his mind. 18 years of corporate tenure, alliances with board members, a silver tongue sharpened by ambition and greed. He had orchestrated Daniel's downfall with surgical precision, turning trust into treachery. Every memo Daniel had written, every cautionary note about the Henderson portfolio, had been dismissed, deleted, erased as if it had never existed. And then, when the inevitable losses materialized, Richard had pointed his finger and built a paper trail of deception so convincing that even Daniel, careful and precise, might have doubted his own reality. Daniel replayed the months leading up to his termination in his mind like a forensic examination. He remembered the spreadsheets he had flagged, the emails he had sent, the warnings he had placed in the inboxes of executives who had barely glanced at them before forwarding the documents to the next desk. He had been thorough, meticulous, almost obsessive in his attention to detail, and yet it had all been weaponized against him. Richard had taken advantage of every loophole in the system, every oversight, every procedural gap, and then amplified it into an accusation that made Daniel appear reckless, greedy, even corrupt. He remembered the internal memos he had sent: margin exposure in Henderson portfolio exceeds risk tolerance, recommend reevaluation. He had signed them carefully, time-stamped, addressed to his direct supervisor. But one by one, they had vanished from the server, replaced by falsified logs showing late-night system access, unauthorized trades, backdated approvals. Evidence of innocence had been transformed into evidence of guilt. And Clare Ashworth, in her pristine office 30 floors above the plaza, had never asked a single question. She had read the fabricated documents, nodded at the neatly printed conclusions, and signed the papers that ended his career without a second thought. The more Daniel thought about it, the more the magnitude of the betrayal became clear. This was not a simple case of corporate mismanagement. It was premeditated, elegant in its cruelty, executed with the kind of cold intellect that left no traces, no witnesses, no hesitation. Richard had planned it to the last detail, counting on the efficiency of bureaucracy and the blind trust of leadership to carry out the execution. It was a crime built not with force but with silence, omission, and manipulation, the perfect crime. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant carol drifting from a neighbor's apartment. And then his eyes landed on Sophie, asleep with her small hand clinging to the crayon drawing, and something hardened in his chest. This was no longer just about a job. This was about protecting the truth, preserving integrity, and reclaiming the world that had been stolen from them. Richard Thorne had underestimated him, not his skill, not his intelligence, but his refusal to surrender to fear or despair. Daniel opened his laptop and began compiling every trace of evidence he could find, every email, every memo, every report he had personally authored. He cross-referenced timestamps with Sophie's school records, doctor appointments, any proof that could corroborate his presence elsewhere during the times Richard had claimed he was manipulating the system. The task was immense, exhausting, but necessary. In the quiet of the Christmas Eve night, the glow of the city seeping through the blinds, he understood one immutable truth: Richard Thorne could destroy a career, a reputation, but he could not destroy a father's resolve. Somewhere far above, Clare Ashworth closed her ledger for the night, satisfied with the order she had imposed on the chaos of her company. But Daniel Mercer, armed with the truth and an unbreakable will, was already constructing a storm that would descend upon Whitmore Financial with all the inevitability of a winter blizzard, beautiful, silent, and unstoppable. The snow had begun in whispers that morning, light flakes drifting lazily from the gray sky, settling on the glass of Whitmore Financial like dust on a forgotten ledger. From her corner office 32 floors above the city, Clare Ashworth watched the streets blur into a silver-gray haze. The office was quiet, emptied of most staff who had scuttled home to their families and holiday plans. Only the faint hum of the heating system and the occasional chime of a distant elevator punctuated the stillness. She sipped her scotch slowly, savoring the burn, the routine comfort of a ritual she had perfected over years of solitude. Yet the warmth from the amber liquid could not reach the cold knot in her chest. Her mind kept returning to the scene she had witnessed 3 weeks prior. Daniel Mercer leaving her office with that measured dignity, signing papers she had handed to him with such quiet composure, as if the weight of the world rested solely on his shoulders and he carried it with the grace of a man unbroken. And then there was Sophie, pressed against the glass, little eyes wide, searching for the father she loved and suddenly finding him trapped in a world of incomprehensible cruelty. Clare had told herself it was business. She had repeated it like a mantra: efficiency, responsibility, risk management. But the words felt brittle now, like ice cracking underfoot. Clare could not stop thinking about that little girl's face, the way it had pressed against the glass, hope and confusion intermingled in perfect, unguarded honesty. A child's gaze was sharper than any audit, clearer than any spreadsheet. And it had pierced her, slicing through the layers of control, detachment, and self-justification she had built over decades. She leaned closer to the window, tracing the street below where people scurried with shopping bags and frozen mittens. Somewhere down there, Daniel Mercer had walked, silent and uncomplaining, while she had signed away his livelihood without a single question. For the first time in her career, Clare felt herself vulnerable. Not in a way that could be quantified in KPIs or annual reviews, but in the raw, unmeasurable space where conscience met consequence. Her fingers drummed against the polished mahogany of her desk, the scotch untouched now, its warmth no longer comforting. She recalled her own father, a man crushed by misplaced trust and stubborn pride, and the lessons she had vowed never to forget. Yet here she was, standing in the same cycle, complicit in an injustice, blind to the human cost. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer was no longer the man confined to the sterile corridors of corporate Whitmore. He moved through the city like a shadow with purpose, gathering fragments of proof from emails, memos, and time-stamped records he had been keeping meticulously since the day of his termination. Each discovery was a small victory, each discrepancy a spark to the fire that had begun quietly smoldering within him. He had memorized the building's IT architecture, the weaknesses in the system Richard Thorne had exploited, and now he wielded that knowledge not to destroy, but to uncover the truth. Clare's doubt was growing, gnawing at her like a relentless winter wind. Every boardroom victory, every quarterly report, suddenly seemed hollow. Her meticulously curated world, built on the precision of numbers and the certainty of authority, felt like a house of cards teetering above a chasm. And yet, she resisted the pull of inquiry, clinging to procedure, to control. She told herself she could not act without evidence, but the truth pressed against her like the snow against her windowpane, demanding recognition. That afternoon, Daniel walked past the lobby unnoticed, a man invisible yet unstoppable. The festive lights reflected off the polished floors, mocking in their cheer. And in the executive suite above, Clare Ashworth realized that the real test of leadership was not in metrics or margin calls. It was in courage, the courage to admit error, the courage to confront deception, the courage to act when the world demanded compliance and silence. The first thread of reckoning had been pulled, and soon the tapestry of lies Richard Thorne had woven would unravel, sweeping through the sterile hallways with the quiet inevitability of a storm. Clare's hands tightened on the edge of her desk as she stared at the city below. Somewhere, Daniel Mercer was gathering the fragments of his life, his dignity, his truth, and she knew, if she did not act, the consequence would not just be professional. It would be personal, moral, and eternal. And the snow continued to fall, relentless, pure, and impartial, blanketing the city in a gray-white judgment that no office protocol could ever override. The highway outside Hartford was a ribbon of black ice and reflected streetlights, a cold, unbroken corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity. The temperature had plummeted, cutting through Clare Ashworth's cashmere coat like a blade she could not dull. She had been driving home after a long day of meetings, her mind a whirl of numbers, schedules, and projections, when the Mercedes shuddered and died. The dashboard glowed with warnings she barely understood, lights flashing red against the deepening night. She pressed the horn once, impatiently, and the sound echoed against the empty shoulder, swallowed by the darkness. She was 20 miles from the nearest town, the only movement the occasional passing truck whose tires hissed across the frozen asphalt. Her phone blinked 2%, an ironic reminder of her own vulnerability. Clare had built a career on control, on foresight, on knowing precisely how every situation would resolve. And yet here she was, stranded on the shoulder of a winter highway, helpless and alone, the illusion of mastery shattered by a loose battery cable she could neither diagnose nor fix. She exhaled slowly, her breath fogging the cold air, and wondered if anyone else would notice if she simply stayed in the car, waiting for a miracle. The miracle arrived, improbably, in the form of a pickup truck that pulled over behind her, hazard lights blinking. A man stepped out, his movements calm, deliberate, and purposeful, the kind of man who belonged in the world of hands and sweat and solutions, not corporate power and glass towers. Clare barely recognized him at first. He was stripped of the suit, the tie, the badge of his corporate identity. The snow clung to his boots, his jacket dusted with white, and yet there was something unshakable in his stance, a quiet certainty that demanded trust. Daniel Mercer. Clare's breath caught in her throat, the world tilting on an axis she had long assumed was fixed. He approached her vehicle with a flashlight in one hand, the other poised to assess the engine, and she felt a flicker of the same disbelief she had seen in Sophie's eyes weeks earlier. He looked entirely ordinary, impossibly calm, and utterly unaffected by the destruction of his career. The man she had signed the termination papers for, her most decisive, unemotional act of the season, was kneeling in the snow to help her without a hint of resentment, without a single reference to the injustice done. "You've got a loose battery connection," he said, voice steady, trained. Hands moved efficiently, almost effortlessly, testing terminals, checking fluid levels, tightening cables. He worked like a man who understood systems not in terms of profit margins or reports, but in terms of cause and effect, of logic and craft. Clare watched, trapped by an awareness she had not anticipated. The man she had destroyed was capable of patience, kindness, and precision beyond her capacity to control. The absurdity of the situation pressed against her chest. Sophie's small voice cut through the cold night. "Daddy helps everybody," she announced from the truck seat, breath fogging the glass. "He fixed Mrs. Patterson's fence. He shovels Mr. Kim's driveway. He makes really good pancakes." The litany of everyday heroism, so ordinary, so human, rendered Clare powerless in ways her empire never had. Daniel glanced at her, not with judgment, not with accusation, but with the calm of a man who had endured far more than she could ever imagine. The repair completed, he wiped his hands on a rag, nodded, and said, "You should get the alternator checked. Manny's service station, about 4 miles up. Honest people." He offered no lecture, no explanation, only competence. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to unravel the enormity of her mistake in words, but they failed her. He slid back into his truck, Sophie clinging to his hand, and drove away, leaving Clare standing alone in the snow, feeling smaller than she had in decades. The wind cut through her coat as she exhaled slowly. She realized, with sudden clarity, that the ledger of numbers, the reports, the policies, they were meaningless without discernment, without humanity. Daniel Mercer had just demonstrated something she could not buy, could not manipulate, moral integrity, unshakable even in the face of betrayal. The snow fell harder, and Clare Ashworth, CEO of one of the most powerful financial institutions in the country, felt the weight of guilt settle like frost on her shoulders, heavy, persistent, inescapable. She would have to confront the truth, and she knew, instinctively, that the reckoning would not wait for her convenience. Clare Ashworth sat in her penthouse office, the city lights below blurred by the condensation on the glass. The snowstorm had intensified overnight, turning Hartford into a silent, silvered labyrinth. Every flake that fell seemed to mock her, sparkling reminders of the moments she had missed, the life she had overlooked, the man she had destroyed with a single signature. She stared at her reflection in the window, the polished surface of glass and steel offering a perfect double, one of control, power, and confidence, the other of uncertainty, guilt, and exhaustion. Neither could tell the full story, neither could undo what had been done. The memory of Daniel Mercer kneeling in the snow to fix her car returned with an almost unbearable clarity. How had she signed those termination papers without a word, without a glance, without questioning the documents she had trusted implicitly? The more she thought about it, the more she realized her own failure had been a symptom of a larger rot in the office, a rot she had ignored, buried under spreadsheets and quarterly projections, thinking that numbers could stand in for judgment, that protocol could replace conscience. By dawn, Clare had made a decision. She would not sit in paralysis. If the truth could not find its way to Daniel organically, she would bring it to light herself. She summoned Janet, her trusted IT specialist, the one colleague whose loyalty had never wavered over a dozen years of service. Together, they entered the server room, a cathedral of humming machines and blinking lights. Janet's fingers danced across keyboards with the familiarity of a pianist, while Clare watched, absorbing the cadence of their investigation. Every keystroke was a promise, a small rebellion against the injustice that had been perpetrated. They began with the obvious, the Henderson portfolio logs, the memos that had been flagged, the emails that Daniel had sent warning of risks. Clare's eyes narrowed as she traced timestamps, discrepancies, and deleted files. Something did not add up. The access logs showed activity at times when Daniel had been documented elsewhere, attending school events with Sophie, at doctor appointments, even in traffic on the highway. Someone had forged the logs, manipulated the system, and had done so with the precision of a surgeon, but with an arrogance that assumed no one would ever look closely. Hours passed like days. Clare felt the chill seep through her cashmere coat despite the heat. Each recovered email, each trace of deleted file, each backdated signature uncovered was a revelation, and a dagger. Richard Thorne's name appeared again and again, his fingerprints implicit in every manipulated record. The sophistication of his scheme was staggering, yet it was also reckless. He had underestimated the persistence of those with nothing left to lose. Clare had realized, in quiet horror, that she had been complicit in the destruction of an innocent life, and now the weight of that realization pressed upon her chest like a physical force. By late afternoon, the evidence was undeniable. Richard had orchestrated the entire downfall of Daniel Mercer, fabricating trades, backdating approvals, deleting warnings, and presenting a perfectly convincing narrative to Clare herself. She felt the ice around her heart crack, a slow, painful fracture that left her raw and human. It was not just about righting a professional wrong, it was about reclaiming her own moral compass, about salvaging the integrity she had prided herself on for decades. Clare knew what had to be done. She drafted a secure report, each page meticulously detailed, each piece of recovered evidence annotated and corroborated. She contacted the legal department, federal regulators, and prepared to confront Richard Thorne directly. This was no longer a corporate matter. This was personal, ethical, elemental. As she walked the quiet corridors of Whitmore Financial that evening, every echo of her heels against polished floors reminded her that she could no longer rely on distance or detachment. Action was required. Truth demanded confrontation. Justice demanded courage. And Clare Ashworth, CEO of a financial empire, felt something she had not felt in years, the fragile, intoxicating thrill of responsibility not to shareholders, not to metrics, but to humanity itself. The storm outside had reached a crescendo, wind rattling the windows, snow piling against the curb. Clare paused outside Richard Thorne's office, the weight of evidence in her hand, and felt the first true stirrings of fear and anticipation mingling in equal measure. She was about to expose a man who had built his life on lies, and in doing so, she would either reclaim the moral ground she had lost, or witness the full fury of someone who believed himself untouchable. And somewhere, a clock ticked toward reckoning, each second drawing them closer to a confrontation that could not be undone, a truth that demanded to be spoken, and a justice that had waited far too long. Richard Thorne leaned back in his corner office chair, the city sprawled beneath him like a glittering ocean of oblivion. The storm had passed, leaving streets coated in ice, shimmering in the pale light of morning. He sipped his espresso, the bitter warmth failing to mask the tension threading through his shoulders. For 18 years, he had built a fortress of influence within Whitmore Financial, a maze of alliances, favors, and meticulous manipulation. But today, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, the silence more pregnant with expectation. He could almost hear the pulse of consequences inching closer, a heartbeat he could neither evade nor control. The knock on the door was measured, deliberate. Clare Ashworth entered without hesitation, her heels clicking against the marble floor, each step a drumbeat of authority that echoed through the office. Richard's practiced smile flickered, a brief, involuntary crack, before he masked it with the veneer of casual superiority. "Clare," he said, voice smooth, controlled. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she placed a thick, manila folder on his polished mahogany desk with a precision that suggested both restraint and inevitability. The folder seemed to radiate consequence, a weight beyond paper and ink. "Open it," she said simply, voice calm, but her eyes smoldered with the fury of a winter storm long restrained. Richard opened the folder with a slow, deliberate motion, feigning curiosity. Page after page, his face betrayed the first signs of unease. Internal memos deleted and restored. Time-stamped records showing Daniel Mercer's verified presence at school events, doctor appointments, and after-school programs during the hours he was accused of manipulating trades. Email threads Richard had thought erased, now recovered from shadow backups he had never imagined existed. Each document a nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed lie. "Interesting," he said finally, though his voice no longer carried confidence, only the faint tremor of disbelief. "You're building a case on circumstantial evidence. These logs can be argued, these files." Clare cut him off with a quiet ferocity that made the room itself seem smaller. "These are not logs, Richard. These are timestamps, access codes, deleted files recovered, and emails restored. Every manipulation, every backdated approval, every falsified trade can be traced directly to you. Every signature, every deletion, every attempt to frame Daniel Mercer has your fingerprints. Literally and figuratively." He leaned back, attempting to reclaim composure, but the facade was crumbling. "You don't understand how complex these systems are," he said, words sharp, defensive. "Anyone could have done this. Anyone could have accessed these files. You're building a narrative, not a case. You're trying to justify." "Trying?" Clare's voice rose just enough to cut through his pretense. "I have the evidence, Richard. I've traced every manipulated file, every deleted email, every forged signature. The Henderson losses, $47 million, were your responsibility. Not Daniel Mercer's. And the proof is in this folder." Richard's face paled. The practiced calm of 18 years dissolved into a storm of panic, strategy, and disbelief. "If you do this, the board, the regulators." "You already signed Mercer's termination," Clare said, voice sharp and cold. "You assumed no one would question the documents, that the weight of authority would protect you. But I've asked the right questions. I've verified every fact. And today, Richard, you have no cover." He reached for his phone, a reflexive attempt to summon allies, to create a firewall of influence. Clare's eyes caught the movement, and she spoke with the authority of someone who had spent years wielding power without hesitation. "Do not. I've contacted the legal department, federal regulators, and the board. You have exactly 20 minutes before security escorts you from this building. Your options are gone, Richard. Every door you thought closed in your favor is open now, and you are standing in the center of it, exposed." Richard slumped slightly, realizing that for the first time, he was powerless. All his schemes, manipulations, and carefully curated networks meant nothing against the meticulous pursuit of truth. And in that silence, Clare's calm fury, backed by unassailable evidence, became absolute. He understood the depth of his miscalculation too late. For all his cunning, he had underestimated Clare Ashworth, not her ambition, not her intelligence, but her capacity to confront injustice, to reclaim integrity even at the cost of her own ego. The realization settled over him with the weight of a winter gale. The fortress he had spent decades building was collapsing, not through brute force, but through moral precision, and there was nothing left to salvage. As Claire turned to leave, the storm outside now a quiet memory, she felt the cold clarity of vindication, and the hollow ache of guilt still lingering for what had happened to Daniel Mercer. She had corrected the record, held the guilty accountable, but she knew some wounds required more than evidence to heal. Some debts demanded human reckoning, not corporate absolution. The hallway outside Richard's office echoed with the soft, deliberate steps of approaching security. Inside, a man who had once believed himself untouchable finally understood the immutable truth of accountability. Outside, the city lay in glittering silence, waiting for the justice long overdue to arrive. Spring sunlight filtered through the windows of Whitmore Financial, soft but unrelenting, revealing dust motes drifting like tiny sparks in the air. The city outside seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the story unfolding inside these walls was one of consequence and reckoning. Clare Ashworth moved through the corridors with a quiet purpose, her heels echoing against polished marble, each step deliberate. This was no longer a CEO on autopilot, signing off on paperwork and quarterly reports. This was a woman who had witnessed the human cost of authority wielded without scrutiny, who had felt the tremor of conscience shake the foundations of her empire. Daniel Mercer arrived on the first Monday of April, the spring air still crisp but promising renewal. His truck rattled over the parking lot's uneven asphalt as he drove onto the company campus. Gone was the tension of the previous months, replaced with a calm that spoke of endurance, dignity, and hard-won peace. He stepped out into sunlight, dusting his hands on his jeans, work-worn, grounded, human, and the lobby that had once seemed a mausoleum of corporate ambition now felt alive, somehow softer, somehow possible. Claire was already waiting on the 31st floor, the newly designated office of the Director of Employee Advocacy. She had requested the floor's layout be adapted to promote accessibility, to remove the barriers that hierarchy had once imposed. The nameplate on the door read, Daniel Mercer, Director of Employee Advocacy. He had chosen it himself, rejecting any inflated title, because he wanted his office to be a place where voices mattered, where concerns could be voiced without intimidation, and where integrity was measured not by profit margins but by truth. Their first conversation was cautious, measured, but threaded with understanding. Claire asked about the transition, about the people who had reached out, the colleagues whose guilt manifested in performative warmth or avoidance. Daniel responded with equanimity, as if the past 3 months had reinforced rather than eroded his center. He did not speak of bitterness, he spoke of responsibility, empathy, and the subtle power of leading with humanity. Claire listened, absorbing the lessons she had once ignored, realizing that authority meant little without compassion to temper it. Sophie became an unexpected arbiter of connection. She had long since abandoned the nickname, Car Lady, embracing Claire simply as Claire. Her small victories, inviting Claire to school art shows, sharing lopsided watercolor houses colored yellow because you seem like a yellow person, softened the hard edges of a woman who had long lived in the cold certainty of spreadsheets and projections. Through the child's eyes, Claire glimpsed the possibility of redemption not as a transaction, but as a shared human experience, fragile yet luminous. The Thorne trial concluded in September. The headlines were stark: former SVP convicted on 9 federal charges, ordered to pay full restitution. 12 years in federal prison, a verdict that crystallized justice but did not erase the months of damage done. Claire watched the sentence in silence, seated beside Daniel, Sophie curled in her lap, her tiny hand clutching his arm. There was no celebration, no triumphal gesture, only quiet recognition that truth, finally, had prevailed. In the weeks that followed, Claire learned to inhabit the spaces between efficiency and empathy. She attended soccer games on Saturday mornings, orange slices in hand, cheering for goals scored on muddy fields by children whose parents were more concerned with joy than with performance metrics. She discovered the resonance of stillness, the power of presence, and the delicate alchemy of human connection that numbers could never quantify. The first time Daniel kissed her, it was amidst the chaos of Sophie's birthday party, balloons swaying against the ceiling, cake crumbs scattered on counters, the echo of sugar-fueled laughter ringing like music in the room. The kiss was tentative, respectful, an unspoken acknowledgement of scars, of patience, and of hope. Clare returned it with certainty, not certainty that everything was resolved, but certainty that the future could be approached with authenticity, courage, and trust. Sophie appeared in the doorway, chocolate frosting smudged across her cheeks, demanding another piece of cake. Laughter erupted, unpolished, human, joyous. Clare watched Daniel lift Sophie onto his shoulders, spinning her around, the chaos of the party reduced to a symphony of small, meaningful gestures. She realized then that power, unchecked and cold, could destroy, but when tempered with integrity, humility, and care, it could also rebuild, nurture, and heal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting amber light across the kitchen, Clare reflected on the transformation she had undergone. She had once believed that efficiency and control were the ultimate markers of success. Now she understood that mistakes were inevitable, but integrity, courage, and the willingness to act justly were what truly defined a leader. Outside, the city moved forward, oblivious and yet persistent. Inside, three figures, man, woman, and child, sat together, laughing, eating cake, and allowing themselves, finally, to exist in a space untainted by deceit or fear. The world remained imperfect, occasionally cruel, and endlessly unpredictable. But in this small, sunlit kitchen, with chocolate frosting and laughter and the gentle pulse of life, Clare Ashworth, Daniel Mercer, and Sophie had discovered a version of truth and redemption worth holding on to. And in that fragile, fleeting moment, they allowed themselves to believe that it was enough.